Can start this morning's session, which is the third session dedicated to definitions and typologies within the framework of craft or trade associations in pre-industrial Europe. This time as well, we're going to have three presentations with a short coffee break. I remember all of you, as always, at the end of the full presentation, we're going to gather your possible questions that will be answered afterwards during the Q&A session. The first presentation will be delivered by Germán Navarro Espinach from Zaragoza University. The first trade associations for silk art in the 15th-16th century. Organization changes, common traits and differences. Please.
Buongiorno.
Good morning, anyone. Congratulations to the organizers of this new Latini week. And thank you for accepting my contribution. The study of the earliest guilds of the silk trade in Spain forms part of a broader research project on the agricultural expansion and industrial development of the Crown of Aragon in Mediterranean Europe, funded by the Spanish government's State Research Agency and European Union ERFD funds during 2025-2029. This project also contributes to the program of activities of the CEMA Research Group, Center for Medieval Studies of Aragon, at the University Institute for Research in Heritage and Humanities of the University of Zaragoza. The statutes of the earliest silk guilds in Spain are preserved in the archives of the main industrial centers from the second half of the 15th century onwards. These statutes correspond to the three most important cities of the Crown of Aragon, Valencia, Barcelona, Zaragoza, and on the other end, to Seville, Toledo, Córdoba, Granada, Malaga, and Murcia. In total, around 90 texts of statutes were analyzed, governing a dozen distinct trade across the 9 cities mentioned above between the year 1453 and 1601. First and foremost, it was necessary to identify the technical skills required for each trade in order to fully understand the meaning of its name and its products. A rather significant philological question, I guess, indeed. When the statutes contain descriptions of the master examinations, they assist us in our research. However, in this case study, we must bear in mind that the vocabulary is according to different languages, namely Latin, Castilian, and Catalan. In short, the most significant trades within the silk industry in Spain between the 15th and the 16th century are known in the Italian linguistic context as the silk merchants, silk weavers, spinners, twisters, dyers, veil weavers, weavers of silk cloth or strips, trimmers, and velvet weavers. The latter trade, also known as the art of velvet makers. As can be seen, we are faced with a list of 40 guilds with a total of 86 statutes, partial figures that future research would undoubtedly expand and complete. The most general trade of all in the silk industry in Spain corresponds to the silk merchant, the merchant who controlled the manufacture and trade of the silk in the city. Statutes for silk merchants were approved in Granada, Seville, Toledo, Malaga, and Córdoba. In the ordinances of Granada of 1512, silk merchants are defined as those who produce and sell silk and cannot open a shop without passing an examination. The same occurred in Seville in 1513, where silk merchants couldn't open shops and sell silk unless they had been examined, though the nature of the examination was not specified. This lack of clarity is also evident in the association of silk weavers, known as the arte della seta, but without any explicit specialization in their name. It was only when the division of labor became sufficiently pronounced in the expanding manufacturing towns and the high level of production specialization gave rise to conflicts over technical expertise between related trades that guilds emerged with very specific trade names, accompanied by detailed descriptions of the examinations required to attain mestieri. The preparation of the raw material in the initial stage of the production process was entrusted to the guilds of silk spinners and twisters. There are records of silk spinners guilds in Murcia, Granada, and Cordoba. Meanwhile, silk twisters were independent trades in Valencia, Granada, and Toledo. A single guild of silk spinners and twisters exists in Zaragoza. In the case of Cordoba, silk twisters and weavers were part of the same association, one of the oldest in Spain, founded in 1478. Whilst in Seville, they were referred to by a common name for both trades, namely spinners of the silk twisting workshop. The silk spinners of Murcia were examined by a municipal inspector in 1486, as the previous ordinance of 1447 had already noted that they did not work with the same skill as the craftsmen of Almeria, Valencia, or Xàtiva. To increase their earnings, they were paid according to the quantity of silk spun, rather than receiving a fixed wage. Municipal ordinances on silk spinning in Granada stipulated in 1535 that no spinner could work without having been examined and without holding a certificate issued by the municipal clerk, allowing women to receive their wages either for every 1,000 cocoons spun into skins, or a fixed sum. The status of the twisters of Granada in 1542 stated that no one could work at the twisting machine without having passed an examination, further prohibiting the ownership of more than 2 machines per owner, and limiting each work's capacity to a maximum of 200 spindles. Half a century later, the Statutes of Granada of 1589 introduced various regulations concerning the work of the city's master spinners, with the aim of preventing fraud and deception. The regulations of the Civil Silk Spinners Guild of 1513 stipulated that one had to pass a master examination before 2 guild inspectors in order to be permitted to spin silk on a spinning wheel, and include a general description of the required tests. The applicant had to be able to set up the spinning frame, the present examiners, producing yarn intended for the manufacture of veils or for the weaving of velvets, as each required different configuration of setting up. Subsequently, the candidate had to operate the machine manually by hand without giving theoretical explanation of the process in front of the 2 examiners and 2 other expert masters. If deemed suitable, a certificate of qualification was issued. The description of the examination is much more detailed in the case of the silk spinners and twisters of Zaragoza in 1569. It could last up to a maximum of 40 days at the guild hall, where a spinning frame had already been set up for this purpose. The test began by setting up the machine in a cross-shaped and level position, followed by the twisting, squaring, and buttoning 2 dozen spindles, half intended for spinning and the other half of spindles for warping. Each candidate paid for the items required for this operation out of their own pocket. Silk dyers achieve a degree of institutional autonomy in cities such as Valencia and Granada. Valencian dyers were initially grouped with silk weavers, but they were already listed as an independent trade in the statutes of 1549, coinciding with the industrial growth that the dyeing sector was then experiencing so far. The preamble of these ordinances emphasized that as the Kingdom of Valencia was rich in silk of its own production, the forefathers had sought by every means and with the utmost diligence to promote the processing and weaving of silk, both in the city and throughout the kingdom, owing to the enormous benefit that this activity brought to the municipal coffers and those of the Generalitat, as well as to the population growth of the capital, since it was considered certain that each silk loom provided a livelihood for 4, 5, even 6 people. The veil weaver of the Crown of Aragona, Valencia, Barcelona, and Zaragoza, produced virtually the same goods as the toqueros, or toca weavers in Castile, with their own guilds in cities such as Seville, Cordoba, or Granada. The status of the toqueros of Seville regulated a wide variety of products, Parisian fabric, silks, various qualities, veils, and headdresses. The Granada ordinances require candidates for the master's examination to be able to weave all the fabrics listed therein. Parisian cloth, veils, various type, plain silk, Portuguese rodeos, cotton, and silk rodeos, coxas weavers, coarse woven fabrics, Moorish hoods, as well as double and triple sieves. The range of products is similar to that regulated by the ordinances of the Valencia veil weavers between 1465 and 1519. Veils for Muslim women, veils for Christian women, Paris cloth, light and dense rodeos, cloth for sieves, and cloth for banners. The artisan, whose skills were given the special designation of arte della seta, were the velvet weavers, velluters, veluteros, teodores de Terciovelo. The origins of these all lie in Italy, where the main guilds of the silk trades were gradually established, pioneering near the development of institutional category of the silk guild, designed to distinguish itself for the rest of urban craftsmanship. The issue is fully part of the broader context of the guild movement within the major European textile manufacturing centers. Statutes governing the weavers of velvet and other luxury fabrics were in place in the cities of Valencia, Toledo, Seville, Cordoba, Granada, Barcelona, and Zaragoza. Furthermore, although they did not call themselves velvet weavers, the silk weavers of Granada also produced velvets, damasks, satins, taffetas, and the same was true of the silk weavers of Murcia, who could be examined on their production of velvet, damask, taffeta, and other silk fabrics. A witness in a trial in 1516 stated that it was Italian silk weavers, particularly those from Genoa, who introduced the art of weaving silk velvet to Valencia, promoting the establishment of the Velvet Makers Guild, with its Brotherhood of Saint Jerome in 1477, approved by the City Council in 1479, and confirmed in the same year by King Ferdinand II of Aragon, who conferred upon the Guild the title of Art de Velluters, the institutional origin of the future College of the Art of Silk in Valencia, established by King Charles II of Spain in 1686. Although there was a considerable group of Jewish covert silk weavers in Barcelona, as was coming out of Spanish cities from 1555, company known as the Sociedad de las Sedes was established. under the direction of a Genoese merchant supported by several Catalan partners. For a long time, there was no guild regulation, despite the presence of a silk craft industry that had been active in the city for the same time. Finally, in 1547, the silk velvet weavers of Barcelona obtained a charter from Prince Philip to found the Guild of Velvet Makers. The municipal authorities of Barcelona approved more detailed regulation of the silk trade, stipulating, amongst their other things, that black silks were to be dyed with pure gold without any mixture of pomegranate, and that the silk was to be twisted lengthwise using spindles similar to those used in Valencia. Furthermore, the first chapter established the adoption of the same standard for the width of loom combs as laid down in the ordinances of Valencia and other parts of Italy and Spain, where silks were woven. The Guild of Velvet Makers and Silk Weavers of Zaragoza was also dedicated to Saint Jerome, the same patron saint as the Art de Veluteurs of Valencia. On the other hand, the first chapter of the 1486 regulation for the velvet weavers in Toledo established the adoptions of the Genoese standard for the manufacture of velvets, granting the weavers a period of 1 year to procure combs of that width for their looms, using a model and original velvet from Genoa, sealed by the Toledo authorities. In Seville, the velvet weavers' ordinances were approved in 1492 and confirmed in 1502, establishing technical standards consistent with other Iberian manufacturers under Genoese influence. Conversely, the mask could be produced according to Venetian and Genoese models. The requirement to use Genoese-made combs in Granada silk ordinances is first recorded in 1515. Subsequently, the ordinances of 1526 include the instruction on how black silk was to be dyed, in accordance with the regulation of other peninsular silk producing centers. Similarly, Murcia eventually adopted the technical expertise of the Genoese industry due to the immigration of foreign weavers who were already present in the city around 1497. These Murcian ordinances clearly stipulated that the width of double velvet must conform to the Genoese standard and required 5 years of apprenticeship to sit the master's examination and set up one's own loom, a duration in line with that practices in Valencia, Toledo, Seville, and Granada. The most significant silk regulations for the city of Malaga date back to 1552, and in addition to the influence exerted by Granada and Seville, they consistently reiterate the obligation to use Genoese-made combs for weaving velvets, whilst also confirming the use of pure gold for dyeing black silks. The ordinances of Cordoba of 1529 also stipulated that combs for weaving velvets and other silk fabrics intended for clothing must be of the same length of the Genoese standard, noting, as in the case of Malaga, that such combs tended to shrink over time, unfortunately. Through a comparative and diachronic analysis, such as that conducted here on the earliest guilds of the silk trade in Spain, craftsmanship became a key player in the economies and societies of the Crown of Aragon and Castile during the transition from the Middle Ages to the modern era. Similarly, the institutional category of the Silk Guild, brought from Italy to Spain, together with the technological transfer of Genoese black velvet, constituted the highest level of prestige achieved ever by the Guild movement. A key model of political organization for artisans, but also a unique vantage point for understanding the relationship between trades, innovations, and technical progress. In Spanish cities, we thus see a multicultural context of symbiosis between the innovations of Italy and the long-standing traditional silk manufacturing in Muslim Spain, preserved by modernas, Jewish and Christian artisans along the international Silk Road. In this sense, my study concludes with the presentation of an appendix in which I list the name of fabrics and other silk products regulated by the 87 statutes of 40 guilds, analyzed during the research in 9 Spanish cities. The complexity of the technical vocabulary employed was remarkable. Astonishing. The aim is to contribute to the understanding of the multilingual richness and intercultural perspective that characterize the in-depth analysis of the world of craft guilds in Mediterranean Europe from the Middle Ages onwards, through the beautiful press of the art of silk. The commercial people who practiced the same trade in medieval towns developed a certain sense of collective or group identity based on various factors: technical specialization, geographical concentration, membership of the same guilds, assemblies, festivals, and shared customs. Essentially, what they sought were new forms of connection between politics and the economic order to legitimize the presence of their organized interests. However, the craft sector constituted a heterogeneous social group. The guilds primarily represented the class interests of the master craftsmen who governed them, who drafted their statutes to be approved by municipal authorities and sovereigns, kings. They aimed to control production of clearly defining their specific technical skills, but also they sought to regulate the labor market as strictly as possible, imposing restriction on apprenticeships and access to master status. Thank you so much for your kind attention, all of you.
Grazie a Germán Navarro Espinach per questo.
Thank you. Thank you, Navarro Espinach, for this overview, very interesting in the territories of the Crown of Aragon and Castilla, and also for underlining the philological aspects of this database, of this very wide database. And there's multiple cases in the Spanish context, which is quite rich if confronted with the speeches of the 2 Portuguese colleagues in their territory, in their region, in their country. So now we have the second speech of this day, Valeria Chilese from the University of Milan, stone mason quarrymen, stone masons and craft guilds in towns and the countrysides, the case of Valpolicella between the 16th and 18th century. So we're now changing completely the topic. So we are now moving in the county. So that's, again, what we were talking about yesterday, so the relationship between city and countryside, as we were talking about with Andrea Caracausi yesterday. So the ways in which stone masons and stone cutters organize their work in the society of the ancient regime have generally been studied from the perspective of municipal clients, analyzing the way they were organized into craft guilds and operated on large-scale urban building sites, with the exception of Klapisch Zubers. In-depth analysis of Carrara, however, the situation of workers at the sites of extraction and initial processing of marble and stone has not yet been investigated in a systematic manner. This is primarily due to the difficulty in finding documentary material. We therefore know a great deal about individual quarrymen and contractors, but still little about the rural communities involved in this type of activity. My presentation aims to provide some insights in this regard, analyzing the situation in Valpolicella during the period spanning from the late 16th century to the mid-17th century. The starting point for this ongoing research is a study conducted some 20 years ago by Pierpaolo Brugnoli and several members of the Documentation Center for the History of Valpolicella. The research reconstructed the genealogy genealogy of several families of marble and stone masons from Sant'Ambrogio di Valpolicella, highlighting the presence of a core group of families active since the Middle Ages, many of whom are still working in the stone industry today. The study also indicated the existence from the 12th century onwards of a fully fledged organization capable of supplying rough-hewn or semi-finished marble for the creation of column-bearing lions and various types of architectural elements at the main building sites across the Po Valley, from Verona to Ferrara, from Cremona to Parma, and Modena as far as Ancona and Pesaro. So despite such an extensive commercial interest, however, there was no form of guild-like organization, unlike, in fact, what Klappisch-Zuber highlighted for the Carrara area. In the case of Milan, there is no indication to that effect. The only structured body existing in the area was of a religious nature. It was not until 1675 that the confraternity of the Four Crowned Saints was established, albeit with exclusively devotional aims. Building on these premises, this research aims to reconstruct the modus operandi of the Ambrosians, investigating their relationship with Verona and with the guilds operating in the city, as well as the relationships between the local quarrymen and the urban authorities on the other hand, and the Venetian authorities on the other. From a documentary perspective, the material used is highly diverse. A core body consists of the parish registers and wills studied by Brugnoli. This documentation has been supplemented by the 15th and 16th century Veronese parish registers, and in particular by urban and rural land surveys, which enable us to identify the occupations of residents and their holdings. We then proceeded to examine notarial deeds, which are painting a rather vivid picture of life in Ambrosia. Among the documentary collections of particular interest is that of the Domus Mercatorum, which contains various material concerning the craft guilds, and the collection of the Vicari della Valpolicella. These sources, as mentioned, are quite diverse, thus allowing for an analysis from various perspectives of the strategies employed by the Ambrosians. Attention has focused in particular on the 16th and 17th centuries, a period during which, amidst intense quarrying and trading activity, the stonemasons of the area gradually acquired a growing awareness and a certain strategic capacity in relation to the city and the guild system, whilst preserving a fair degree of autonomy. The Rosso Verona marble quarries, whether open cast or underground, were scattered across the hills behind the villages of Sant'Ambrogio, and in some cases they are still visible today. Quarrying, generally carried out on outcrops close to the surface, was relatively straightforward, and extraction techniques remained largely unchanged until the second half of the 20th century. Once extracted, the marble blocks were initially worked on-site under the supervision of the master stonemason, who in the Ambrosian area was very often also the quarry owner. Once the initial stages of processing were complete, the marble was taken over by the stonemasons themselves and transported to the river port of Pescantina, where it was loaded onto boats bound for the destination site, where it would be finally worked and installed. The area, known since Roman times, began to be exploited intensively, particularly during the Augustan period, supplying stone material throughout the medieval period. Overall, this flow appears to have remained constant over time, as evidenced by the numerous artifacts made from Veronese red marble in the Po Valley and Trentino regions, and by the records preserved at the Verona Customs Office and in the archives of the River Transporters Guild. The economic significance of mining, on the other hand, is evident from a study of 17th century estimates. It's no coincidence that in his book of Valpolicella in the early modern period, Varanini, when analyzing the area of Sant'Ambrogio and the neighboring river valley, speaks of an economy that was different from the rest of the valley. Whilst, in fact, during the period in question, the flow of migration from Valpolicella to the city appears to have been constantly increasing due to the growing imbalance between labor and resources that characterized the area as a whole, the situation in the Sant'Ambrogio area remained largely stable. migration, the movement to the city followed a pattern already observed in the 15th and 16th centuries, linked essentially to patronage and the need to carry out certain works on site. And these were mostly temporary moves. Those who retained their residence in Sant'Ambrogio formed a clearly identifiable group, as evidenced in particular by the census compiled in 1628. This records 158 men aged between 18 and 70. Approximately 30% are described as stonecutters. Alongside these, the land surveys indicate the existence of households whose livelihood appeared to be linked to agriculture, small to medium-sized landowners, 60%, and farm laborers, around 10%. This is a particularly interesting point. The presence of farm laborers, in fact, is unique to the Ambrosian census, distinguishing it from those compiled in the same years in other parts of the valley. This suggests that the clear separation between economic and occupational groups in the village encouraged the tagliapietra to employ wage laborers to work their land. In other words, a group of families had emerged characterized by a specific productive role and clearly distinct from the others involved in agricultural work. Families able to support themselves through the marble trade, to the extent that they were able to lease some of their own plots to laborers. A sort of elite, in other words, from which during the 17th century certain prominent figures would emerge, capable of becoming key players in the town's commercial and economic life. It's interesting to note, however, that the quarries are not described in the valuation records. The land owned by stonemasons' families is in fact recorded in general terms, or as being intended for the cultivation of olive trees, vines, and mulberry trees. What varies for plots of the same size is the value attributed to individual plots, which sometimes reach considerable sums. The quarries feature more prominently in other documents held in the Vicari della Valpolicella collection, or in the notarial deeds relating to the division of property, or in documents concerning disputed management debts to be settled or disputes between owners. The difficulty in finding precise descriptions of the quarries stems from two basic factors. On the one hand, this is due to the way in which the Ambrosian quarries were managed. They were opened and subsequently abandoned, sometimes restoring the agricultural landscape. If necessary, it was possible to resume quarrying at a later date. A second problem stemmed from the policy implemented by the Venetian Republic regarding quarries and mines, which were administratively subject to the control of the Council of Ten. In reality, the actual exercise of this control was rather problematic, precisely because of the behaviors such as that seen in Ambrosia. For this reason, in the second half of the 17th century, the three deputies over the mines were permanently established, from whom it would be necessary to request a concession for exploitation, naturally upon payment of a fee. Obviously, it is therefore only after the middle of the century that the Ambrosian quarries begin to leave some official traces. In 1670, for example, a printed list was drawn up of the stone quarries found in the Veronese territory. A total of 17 quarries are described, but only 7 of these were actually invested, that is, duly authorized and therefore subject to the payment of tax. Whilst Venice sought to exercise greater control over quarries and mines, the Ambrosians attempted to offer some resistance. As early as February 1675, some of the town's most prominent families, in the presence of the notario Carlo Turisendi, entrusted Andrea Egidi with the task of appearing before any court, magistrate, or council in the illustrious city of Venice to present one or more petitions to seek a dispensation and exemption from the tithe that His Serene Highness demands on the land and estates. Andrea Egidi is a merchant. We find, which is quoted also about the Palazzo Ducale in Modena. So at present, research has not yet uncovered any documentation regarding the actual use of this power of attorney. It is worth noting, however, the responsiveness of the people of Milan, which during the same years is confirmed, as we shall see see shortly in relation to the issue of transporting marble via the Adige River. Also, during the 17th century, the Stonemasons Guild was established in Verona. This was a late establishment forming part of the process of reorganizing the trades initiated by the city in the 17th century. After having long been incorporated into the Masons Guild, the stonemasons thus obtain an autonomous character. The records relating to the guild were unfortunately lost during the Napoleonic era, but the Domus Mercatorum collection preserves some 17th and 18th century material relating to it. In particular, several lists of members have been found. References to the Ambrosians are indeed rare. In 1685, a list of 45 stonecutters includes the name of just one stonecutter residing in Sant'Ambrogio. In addition to him, this document records two other names of stonecutters of Ambrosian origin, who had been living in the city for some time by the time the list was drawn up. However, the guild records contain no entries relating to the Ambrosians. In some cases, there are significant omissions concerning families that were highly active in the marble trade during that period. A few other sporadic references emerged from the Domus records, highlighting a relationship between the two bodies that was not always smooth. Thus, for example, also in 1685, the Ambrosian Giuseppe Franza was investigated at the request of the Guild on charges of practicing the aforementioned craft by working and having stones worked, and particularly certain types of risi, which he then allegedly had delivered to the city on the banks of the Adige, and for engaging in other matters pertaining to the aforementioned craft, even if not described therein. So in short, although active in the city, the Ambrosians tended to disappear from the city, signing contracts with individual representatives of noble families, supplying the necessary stone material to some of the city's most prestigious buildings, but avoiding, as far as possible, being recorded in the documents of the Stonemasons Guild. Although reluctant to register with the Stonemasons Guild, the Ambrosians proved capable of appreciating the advantages offered by the guild system, as demonstrated by the case of the Burchieri, owners of good transport boats, of Pescantina. Situated on the Adige River in the central part of the Valpolicella, the village has always been dedicated to the transport of goods to and from Verona. Although some of the inhabitants of Pescantina were over time registered with the Verona Burchieri Guild, many of the villagers operated independently, so to say, thereby seeking to avoid paying various duties and taxes. Over time, however, the quantity and variety of goods transported increased, and the Pescantines also began dealing in so-called robe da bolletta, goods subject to duty, and therefore generally reserved to the people of Verona. In theory, these goods, especially wine, were supposed, once they reached the Verona, to be loaded onto the boats of the city's merchants, something which in reality did not happen. This led to constant disputes with Verona, which on several occasions called for the intervention of Venetian authorities, with outcomes not always favorable to the citizens. In 1589, in particular, Pescantina obtained permission to transport to Venice all manner of wine, both local and foreign, being able to take some other sort of goods alongside said wine to make up the cargo, provided that the main cargo consists of wine. That's a quotation. A concession that fitted well within the context of Venetian food supply policy, but which at the same time, in its ambiguous wording, left ample scope for the development of other trades. Bolstered by these concessions, the number of boat owners in the small river port grew, so much so that by 1606 there were around 50 cargo barges, a very high number when compared to the 83 barges owned by the Veronese. The expansion of the trade led the people of Pescantina to request that they be recognized as an autonomous guild. In the face of fierce opposition from the Veronese, the boatmen of Valpolicella called upon several witnesses, many of whom came from Sant'Ambrogio. Their testimonies reveal a long-standing custom. It is therefore no coincidence that in 1609, at the height of the dispute with Verona, some 50 sailors from Pescantina appointed an Ambrosian, Giovanni Antonio Gasparini, as their representative. The choice made is interesting. Gasparini represents, in fact, one of the new figures emerging on the Ambrosian scene during this period, a merchant entrepreneur capable of acting as an intermediary between the Ambrosians and Venetian clients, appearing both as a guarantor for the transported marble and as a direct stakeholder in his capacity as a quarry owner in the purchases made by the Venetian nobility. The policy he adopted towards the Veronese appears rather unscrupulous. He essentially went so far as to demand that the exemption granted to wines at the end of the 16th century be applied to marble as well. Gasparini argued for the need for a fast and well-organized transport service, emphasizing that the clientele served consistently largely of the ruling class of the dominant. The request came to nothing at the beginning, but the cooperation between the people of Milan and those of Pescantina continued, eventually leading in 1621 to the establishment of the Guild of Burchieri of Pescantina. These transporters were authorized to carry stones, both for building and for glass-making, barrels, ammunition, and gunpowder destined for Venice. Once in Verona, however, the cargo was to be shared with the Veronese, with the exception of wine. For the Ambrosians, this was no minor matter, since the cost of transporting stone materials largely fell on the quarrymen. Being able to use the transporters from Pescantina allowed them to keep costs down. In conclusion, the case of Sant'Ambrogio demonstrates how between the 16th and 17th centuries a community of quarrymen in the countryside was able to develop autonomous forms of production organization, managing to largely evade the urban guild system and successfully negotiate relations with the market and the institutions. Active since the Middle Ages, during the modern era, the stonemasons of Sant'Ambrogio appeared increasingly capable of managing their own quarrying, sales, and installation activities with growing confidence. There were few concessions to the urban guild system. There were a few areas in which external merchants and operators could gain a foothold. Through the temporary management of many of the quarries, the marble workers of Sant'Ambrogio largely managed to avoid, at least until the mid-18th century, the control of the Venetian magistrates, and at the same time, whilst working constantly on the Veronese building sites, avoided joining the stonemasons' guild. By acting in concert with their neighbors in Pescantina, they secured the creation of a guild structure that served their interests, thereby limiting, at least in part, the costs that would have arisen from entrusting transport to the Veronese. Even if based on indirect documents, the research conducted so far therefore suggests the existence of a conscious choice, namely to strengthen the local economy with its distinctive character compared to the rest of the valley, whilst maintaining a low profile, so to say, and evading the control of the city as far as possible. Thank you.
Interessante del tema del...
For this presentation, thank you very much. The organization of the craft from the rural viewpoint, from the viewpoint of the countryside, and also very interesting indeed what you said about the social traits, the political capabilities of very small-scale community, so making a sort of agency activity which seems not to belong to the rural background.
Patrick Wallis from the London School of Economics and Political Science will speak about jacks of all traders, the connection between guilds and occupation in early modern London. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. Jacks of all trades, it's a very English expression. The next few words, masters of none. So this is a paper about how occupations and guilds relate. Before I get into it, I just want to thank the organisers for the very kind invitation. And it's a chance to talk about something that is not apprenticeship, which is what I've mostly been thinking about for a long time. So just to summarise what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to explore an unusual feature of London's guilds, which is that guild members of one guild could be using the occupation which is governed by a different guild. So the Bakers Guild can include shoemakers. The Grocers Guild can include apothecaries. It can include tailors. This is an unusual thing, so we want to think about it. I'm going to present some measures. We've never had measurement, so I'm going to present some measures. And then I'm going to show you how this odd characteristic, the variation of occupations within guilds in London, varies. Ooh, there we are. Why should you care? Okay. I think you should care because monopoly matters. Monopoly, the idea that guilds contain all the people, or most of the people, using their occupation, is really important to ideas that guilds rent-seek. This is the old Smithian accusation. Rent-seeking is easier if all of the shoemakers are in one group, right? They're all working together. It's also easier if we think about positive interpretations of guilds, like Larry Epstein's argument about apprenticeship, taken up recently by Joel Mokyr and other people. I think arguably, if guilds are coherent, it's probably easier for them to generate social capital as well. So all of the different ways in which guilds have been debated in general in recent years tie quite closely to these ideas of cohesion. There's also another more local reason for histories of English corporatism to think about this, which is that any breakdown of the relationship between a guild and its occupation might help explain decline. Weak English, weak London guilds, they have been a feature of many economic histories of English exceptionalism. One story about this is that this weakening of guilds helps explain the freeing of the economy. And that maybe helps us think about why a story about London might be genuinely interesting. I work in London, I'm always interested in London stories, but this maybe tells a bigger story. London, it's a fun city for this early modern period. It grows amazingly fast from around 1520, 1550 onwards. And at the start of this period, it is a guild city. It's a city of citizens. The government of the city are guild members. But at some point, that power weakens. For 150 years, historians have debated when that changes. So this is a way of thinking about that. And also what consequences come from that change. That might matter more generally because we have several measures of the English economy now that look at GDP per capita, that look at structural change, that look at specialization, and all suggest something happens around 1600. And so whether institutional changes to guilds might explain a wider transformation in the English economy, which is led very much from London, is a question of broader interest. Okay. Why does this problem exist? It exists because of something called the custom of London. The custom of London means that any guild member can use another trade, and in some definitions craft, I'm going to be precise because Matthew's here, irrespective of their guild. So this allows citizens, guild members, a little bit of freedom of choice. Should they go into their father's guild? Should they join the guild of the person who trained them? It also means that they can change occupation, which happens, and it gives them some other advantages we can talk about. Throughout, quality control, supervision of production, that remains with the guild. So but it leaves the guild in a position where they, at least in theory, regulate a much larger group of craftspeople outside of their own institution. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I think, about three things. The first is the intensity of this. How much variation was there between guilds in their occupation? I'm going to talk a little bit about how this changes over time as the economy changes, and I'm going to really speculate about the impact of this heterogeneity. For this paper, we're using two data sets. The nice thing about this is individual level data, which we like, I hope. We're going to start, most of what I'm going to talk about is from 13,000 court discharge bills, which are cases brought by apprentices largely to complain against their masters. This data set runs from 1567 to 1723. It's an amazing source because we have guild and occupation. It's a limited source because it's only people who train apprentices. So it's limited. The other source I'm going to talk about comes from voting records from the 18th century, because voting for Parliament, for the national Parliament, is limited to an elite of London guild members, and they have printed lists with their occupation from a few times in the 18th century. So this is biased, this time to a wealthy elite, but still a fairly large elite. I'm going to show you two measures. I should apologize. I really like measurement. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, I don't know. The first measure is one I'm calling homogeneity, occupational homogeneity. This is the share of the guild's membership who use the trade that guild controls. So this is the percentage of members of the shoemakers guild who are shoemakers. That could be no zero, or it could be 100%. And I think this tells us about the internal characteristics, the internal cohesion of the guild. The second measure is a measure of closure, of occupational closure. This is a measure of what share of all people using the trade that a guild or craft that a guild controls are within that guild. So we imagine there are shoemakers across all the guilds in London. You know, maybe 10%, maybe 80% are in the shoemaker's own guild, and the rest are in other guilds. So we've got this is a measure of the share who are directly within the guild versus those who are citizens but are not within the guild itself. There's various bits of work underlying this. We have to match individuals, occupations, and guilds. We've done that. And there's a question about, well, what falls outside of guild control, and we've checked for that. Oh, that was exciting. Is that me? Oh, I couldn't do this without slides. It would be very hard. So anyway, that's the two measures. So let me show you some results. First set of results are around the 17th century. This is, I think, the most interesting section, so I'll spend a little bit of time on this. So I promised some graphs when I spoke to people earlier. Here are some graphs. So this is a very simple plot. On the x-axis is occupational closure. Remember, that's the share of members within the guild out of all the people in London who are doing a particular trade. And on the y-axis, you have this score of homogeneity, how internally coherent is a guild. You can see, and this is for the early 17th century, 1590 to 1640. This is when London guilds are strong, legally strong, politically strong, strong in various dimensions. You can see very wide variation. Some guilds, look there, the apothecaries. I love the apothecaries. That was my PhD. They are nearly 100% in control of apothecary, of the trade, of pharmacy, and they are nearly all apothecaries. Super coherent. At the other end, we have some guilds like, I've just labeled a few, the mercers or the drapers, where only a tiny minority of those members are doing the trade that the guild controls, and the guild contains lots of people doing other trades. There's a correlation, but only a loose correlation. So we can see here that already, even when London's guilds are strong, they are very diverse. Now, most historians expect this to get worse over the 17th century. It doesn't. This was very surprising. What you see in these graphs are the number, literally the number of guilds in each bracket. Each of those brackets is whether or not they have between, each is a decile of score in homogeneity or closure. So if you look at the right-hand bar, that is the number of guilds with 90 to 100% score on homogeneity or closure. So these, as the graph changes and more guilds are on the right-hand side of the distribution, they are becoming more homogeneous and more closed. And what we've done here is given you 5 graphs for each quarter century from 1600 to 1625 to 1700 to 1725. In 1625 to the first quarter of the 17th century, guilds are very varied. They're almost as likely to be widely varied as they are to being very homogeneous. By the start of the 18th century, sorry, get my numbers right, they are much more likely to be homogeneous and they are much more likely to be highly closed. So guilds, oddly, unexpectedly, become more coherent internally over time. Ooh, wrong button. I'm using this computer. What might explain this? You might think it's power. For London, we can divide the guilds into 2 tiers of power. There's a group at the top who are rich, old, and powerful. They dominate the government of the City of London, and these are big, powerful guilds. The rest, the others, are more weaker, more tied perhaps to their craft. When we look at how homogeneous or how close they are, the rich guilds are least homogeneous. They are least closed. And when we look at how they change over the 17th century, as you can see from this table, the Great 12, the rich guilds, they become less homogeneous and less closed, while it's the other guilds, we might think of as the lesser guilds, who become actually more homogeneous and more closed. So we see different trends, opposite trends, for great and other guilds. Again, power works, but not in a way you might expect. Two other explanations, briefly. It could be age, and it could be size. Now, age matters. As you can see here, when we look at when London's guilds were founded, it's the older guilds that are the most mixed. New guilds, and London continues to see guild foundations throughout the 17th century, they are much more homogeneous. But the size of guilds, that doesn't seem to matter at all, which I was not expecting. I thought, well, big guilds will probably be more diverse, small guilds will be more coherent, but when we have a measure of the size of guilds in the 1660s, we see no relationship at all. Now, why might this change over the 17th century? There's a literature. It's a very exciting literature, looking at the relationship between the city and the guilds in 17th century London. And we know that guilds campaign to get political bylaws, to get local laws to increase the homogeneity of their membership, to force all the shoemakers into the shoemakers' guilds or all the bricklayers into the bricklayers' guilds. I spent some time, we listed those, we tested if they had an effect. In the 17th century, they have no effect. Guilds without laws, without any of these rules, have as much of a change as guilds which do get the laws. So this is not a story about internal political interventions. Now, just the last couple of minutes on the 18th century. London's guilds do face a series of major changes in the late 17th century. Their legal powers are challenged. If you've ever heard of the Glorious Revolution, it spilled out into London's guilds because the power of the crown weakened. London's guilds also grew weaker as the city grew physically bigger. And there's a major fire in 1666, after which some rules are set to one side. What does that do? Well, when we compare here on the y-axis those different scores for the mayor's court in the late 17th century to the score in 1750 on the y-axis and scatter our different guilds, you can see that overall there's a downward trend. London's guilds become less homogeneous in internal cohesion. Most become less controlling, but actually some become a little bit more controlling over the 18th century. There's a difference between the rich, the Great 12, who are here, the big blue block squares, and the others, which are in the red squares. I'm not entirely sure how to interpret that, but I simply point out that it exists. Oddly, when we look at the effect of political interventions in the 18th century, they do have an effect. When we look at those guilds that get a bylaw from London around the 1750s, they actually become more homogeneous if they get a law rather than those that don't. So there's some evidence that in the 18th century, politics does start to matter, even though it did not before. So that was a tour of a lot of graphs. I apologize for the number of graphs. What I wanted to do was try some new measures of how we think about guilds collectively. And what I hope I've shown you is that when we look at this measure of guilds, we see an enormous variation within London among its homogeneity. Homogeneity is much higher among newer guilds. It's lower among among the more powerful guilds. If I try and connect this story to economic changes, oddly, the evolution does not go alongside classic stories of decline. Instead, London's guilds grow more cohesive over the 17th century, changes after 1700, but more cohesive up to that point. And finally, there's no obvious connection between guilds and the dynamism of the London economy as a result. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this fascinating focus on London and its guilds, and also for the hypothesis and the question posed and the interesting conclusions. Passons maintenant à la dernière des présentations de ce matin, qui est à charge de Mathieu Marraud de CNRS, Paris, École des études en sciences sociales, qui va nous parler de titre personnel, exercice collectif du métier. Le 17e et 18e.
So it's about personal titles and collective practice of the profession, privileged apothecaries between the 17th and 18th century. So I would like to also draw different conclusions, but we'll talk about this later. So I invite you to France, where we will examine the pathways to legal employment in towns and cities, where I work mainly, where such pathways were numerous under the Ancien Régime. So whether it be the training pathway, the authorities empowered to validate this pathway, or the authorities empowered to grant a direct right to self-manufacture, numerous avenues are open. The sworn trades naturally tended to embody a growing number of these pathways, thanks to their control of the regulated stages leading to employment. Apprenticeship, journey status, master's examination, the right to run a shop or workshop, and the obligation to submit goods or tools to inspection. Yet these guilds could not encompass all these stages. There's training for master in hospitals, there's independent work within seigneurial clubs, and for the fiefs of the suburbs, there's this possibility of establishing their own communities. We will talk more in depth of this later. Communities are also attached to manufactories. There's also a possibility of princes granting privileges directly. In short, all these phenomena persisted in France until the end of the 18th century. And it is to the last of these that this presentation aims to focus, using the Parisian example of the apothecaries. So who are these apothecaries? They are apothecaries of the king, the queen, the princes of blood, the royal stable, the provost of the hotel. So the judge responsible for offenses committed within the court precincts, who has the authority to grant privileges directly. Then there are the apothecaries to the Saint-Suisse, to the artillery, apothecaries linked to the armed forces, apothecaries to the Bastille. All these men held a range of posts based on privileges or personal charters. Their roles were initially held within the civil and military households of the royal family, but in reality those roles became independent and established themselves in Paris, where the very purpose of these privileges from the mid-17th century onwards was the opening of a permanent shop, a workshop, a shop dedicated to nothing more than and nothing less than the everyday needs of the local residents. All these offices led, by way of exception, to the privileges of the guilds. That is to say, they led to the running of a business that was in fact identical to others, whether in terms of the professional activities it involved or the products sold there. These duties constitute a major means of access to the urban market for remedies, drugs, and medicines. So the reason we have such a wealth of information on these privileged apothecaries, therefore, lies in the inevitable disputes that arose between them and the regulated apothecaries guild, disputes whose protracted nature, spanning more than a century and a half, established a comprehensive structural framework for the preparation and sale of medicines in Paris. What will be of particular interest to us here is one of the consequences of this conflict, namely the formation of a community among the privileged apothecaries. These apothecaries were thrust into general economic competition with the guild and sought to respond by pooling their interests. It is this phenomenon that will be of interest to us today. So the conflicts as drivers to the formation of the guilds, of corporations. So in the world of guilds, well, in terms of iconography, these are some examples. Maybe they are a bit disappointing. But in the first phase, I would like to show, well, several social processes enable urban activities to become institutionalized, yet these are very difficult to trace, as the legal traces they leave behind are in fact very frequently contested and called into question by rival groups. For example, a high court, the Court of Appeal for cases involving the king's privileged subject, the Grand Council, handed down a judgment in 1598, and this judgment immediately signaled the start of a power struggle between the incorporated apothecaries, those belonging to the guild, and the privileged apothecaries, those holding a privilege from the king, of whom there were 6. This ruling recognized the guild's right to inspect the businesses owned by the king's privileged apothecaries and required the presence of a representative from these 6 privileged apothecaries during the inspection. So it thus established a representation for the individuals being inspected. One might therefore think that this ruling, thanks to the new representation by a trustee, safeguards the activities of the privileged apothecaries and encourages a movement towards coalition amongst them. Moreover, as late as 1622, the King's Council required the presence of a physician from the royal house to safeguard the rights of the privileged apothecaries during inspections of their businesses by the guild. These 2 texts, therefore, do exist. But it is said that these texts, that these regulations were not applied, actually. So we have some trace around 1650 of some inspection, but not so much, not so many. Then we also find a judgment by the king, which in 1662, even annulled the effect of the 1598 decree before another reinstated it as early as 1665. So in short, the founding texts establishing collective autonomy in favor of privileged apothecaries were thwarted throughout the period. This general indecision regarding the scope of the texts calls into question the logical transition from the norms to their application, or more precisely, it calls into question the exact chronology of the moments when this transition might occur. In this way, the steps taken by the privileged apothecaries towards a common institution are clearly identifiable within a legislative framework that is dated and recorded, yet they are also part of a legal plurality that prevents them from being precisely anchored in a series of events or reference points. At best, these texts merely reflect the increasing legalization of everyday life and should encourage us to distance ourselves from the dates and milestones they establish. Similarly, the privileged apothecaries wish to interpret certain texts as granting them all collective standing and conferring favorable rights upon them all. In reality, however, such interpretation is entirely retrospective. For example, if we return to this decree of 1598, which is supposed to lay down the rules for inspections of all privileged apothecaries, this decree was drafted solely for the benefit of one of them, which does not prevent it from being interpreted a few decades later as a right applicable to all. So the first lesson, the communitarization of this professional group, the privileged apothecaries, is conceivable through this process of stretching the texts whose validity is not always accepted. Even in 1690, the Guild accused the privileged of making excessive use of this century-old text, 1598, so almost a century before, though this did not prevent institutional effects that the actors sought to derive from. Many professional groups have established themselves using these tactics of extrapolating from professional rules. And we must bear in mind this capacity to distort and reinterpret texts and their mechanisms in the processes of institutionalization within the world of work. This phenomenon had several consequences. So the privileged apothecaries did indeed unite in 1642 to secure their own statutes. But what was the purpose of these statutes? So they were, in fact, a defensive measure against the rigor of the inspections carried out by the Guild on the shops of the privileged apothecaries. And there's no doubt that they reflected a solidarity forged in the face of external aggression. That said, these statutes were in turn subject to constant challenge by the Guild, which hindered their implementation. The Guild argued that no royal letters patent accompanied the statutes and that they were the result of a spontaneous initiative. So what was the consequence of this? Through these statutes, the privileged apothecaries exempted themselves from the formal examination normally conducted before the Guild's wardens and the faculty's physicians. They exempted themselves from the supervision exercised by the city's ordinary royal police in favor of the court police, a police force under the jurisdiction of the so-called provost of the hotel. In practice, however, compliance with the statutes was entirely a matter of individual cases. They were observed only to a very limited extent. We need to keep it in mind. Yet this grey area apparently sufficed to make the posts of the king's privileged apothecaries attractive, and their number continued to rise. As late as 1651, 4 further posts of privileged apothecaries were created. At that time, the number of privileged apothecaries in Paris was equal to that of apothecaries registered with the Guild, namely around 80, and the Guild would persist in seeking to restrict this number until the end of the Ancien Régime. Behind the erratic and contradictory nature of the texts, there is therefore a clear trend towards the communal organization of privileged apothecaries, which, however, remained unfulfilled, like so many other groups in the city. So what is the obstacle here? Firstly, the very effectiveness of the founding texts, as we have just seen. Secondly, the political sphere in which these privileged apothecaries operate. The highly functional hierarchy of the royal court acts as a barrier to the emergence of relationships of equality between individuals who share the same skills, so the preparation and sale of remedies. There's a certain gap there. So disparities persist between apothecaries attached to the princely houses of varying importance. The same applies to the court physicians. who will never form a unified body nor establish themselves as a legal entity, whilst also appointing their own trustees when it suits them. So they organize themselves around common rules and under the same patron, like St. Nicholas. In fact, a hierarchy persisted throughout the period in the way they organized themselves, through processes that the actors were reluctant to describe other than by displaying texts in which rights were asserted and, above all, were deemed to override other rights. So evidence of a common fund can also be found among them, modeled on the one that supports the day-to-day running of the guild. So thus the community of privileged apothecaries asserts its true identity, even if it does so rarely, and the guild accuses it in any case of bearing the false name of a body and community and of being merely a free society open to those who wish to join. That's a quotation. The community is denied its very existence whilst benefiting from texts that are highly favorable to it. It joins the long list of professional groups whose titles and charters do not confer any lasting legitimacy over time. I need to speed up. So professional ties and differences. The proliferation of posts for privileged apothecaries can in fact be explained by a system that was radically opposed to that of the guild. The system governing them was openly corrupt. The posts of privileged apothecaries were treated as offices, the right to hold which was sold to the highest bidder. These offices form part of the regular income for the prince's favorites, who are regularly authorized to increase the number. In this way, even those known as the aides and assistants to the king, 4 apothecaries saw their roles elevated to official posts by the mid-17th century, leading thereto to the opening of shops in Paris. So, in fact, semi-private venality in access to work spanned the entire spectrum of craft and commercial activities in the city. The monarchy used these venality as a financial and political reward for its dignitaries, and it used it as a proof of sovereignty over every function exercised in the public sphere. In doing so, the monarch defends his power to establish all the guilds in existence. He even delegates their administration to certain members of his inner circle, thereby undermining the institutional autonomy of the guilds. Another lesson to be drawn from this case is that at their own level, the privileged apothecaries are driven a broader agenda of political expansion for the monarch's benefit. The tension arising from the creation of new communities is evident even at this level. This feature affects the apothecary trade as it does in many other economic sectors. The office of apothecary is treated as a form of real estate subject to mortgage, and it is therefore subject to the same private transactions as other forms of property, houses, land. It thus frames the trade in remedies within a framework that emphasizes the value of the right to trade. Evidently, the Apothecaries Guild itself is characterized by a similar temptation on the part of its own masters to lease out their masters' licenses. That being said, whilst the alignment of privileged apothecaries with the guild organization of the trade is certainly evident, it does raise a problem of identification. So also in the context of apprenticeship, this divides the two groups of gilded apothecaries and independent apothecaries. In 1670, we know that the apothecary to Monsieur, the king's brother, succeeded in publicly compounding theriac, famous galenic preparation, in the presence of several doctors from the Faculty of Medicine and several guards of the guild. This demonstration was then regarded as the equivalent of a masterpiece and demonstrated the individual's skill. We know that several privileged apothecaries also underwent a regulated apprenticeship under a master of the guild. So much so that as early as 1692, privileged apothecaries were directly encouraged to join the guild, where they were accepted upon the theoretical completion of a masterpiece. So some issues, some problems emerge. We can think that we have a number of practical difficulties, dual decision-making powers within two different assemblies, dual financial contributions towards the running costs of two communities, and so on. One must therefore imagine that beyond these boundaries separating the two communities, individual and family trajectories crossed from one to the other, outlining the contours of a social group that was undoubtedly far more homogeneous than our interprofessional disputes would suggest. Moreover, these boundaries cut across the community themselves. For example, the application for admission of an apothecary to the stables of the king's brother caused immense conflict within the guild in 1696. Nevertheless, 5 privileged apothecaries are listed among the guild's members around 1750. Finally, what of the actual mastery of medicinal preparations between the two types of apothecaries? In fact, a conflict pitted the apothecaries' guild against that of the grocers and chemists throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, specifically regarding these chemical compositions and the necessary pharmaceutical knowledge. However, there are very few comparable references between incorporated apothecaries and privileged apothecaries. So I'm trying to speed up. So the jurisdictional fragmentation, these are very brief texts. I'm not going to comment them. I'm going to draw my final conclusion. So the dispute between the guild-affiliated apothecaries and the privileged ones raises questions for us, just as it did for their contemporaries regarding several types of connection. The connection between formal authorization and actual practice. So again, for sure, yes, I'm going to speed up. I was stepping back about the jurisdictional fragmentation. So this is for sure something very practical. We have also examples of fines, about incarceration. We have the intervention of the police directly in the workshop. We have police raids, searches, seizures, and fines complement. So this is to say that also legitimacy is something important. It's something that determines also the quality of a product. These authorities had the power to seize the production and products. So several disputes, also armed conflicts, arose. In 1736, for example, the entrance to the shop of an assistant apothecary to the king was guarded by a line of archers attached to a privileged court, who threatened to fire their rifles at the guild's guards who had come to inspect the premises. So, and on each occasion, the police rivalry escalated to the level of rival courts. So just a few words to conclude. Again, the dispute between the guild-affiliated apothecaries and the privileged apothecaries raises questions for us, just as it did for their contemporaries regarding several types of connection. The connection between formal authorization and actual practice, the connection between royal and guild-based recognition of professional competence, but also between individual and collective reputation in relation to master of knowledge, and also the connection between the trade's territorial basis and its scholarly foundation. The boundaries between the opposing sides, moreover, are porous, so to say. Many privileged apothecaries were trained within the guild, and the guild welcomed the privileged apothecaries into its ranks. This is an important element in the economical life. So the fact remains that the study of the privilege reveals something about economic life in general. The guild mentality and the appeal of the guild model remained very much alive throughout the 17th and 18th century, even among peripheral groups that were originally organized differently. So in Paris in 1753, there were 89 communities of privileged merchants or artisans, which thus existed alongside the 117 ordinary guilds. Although some of these privileged, so to say, guilds had no more than two masters, they adopted the terminology of the legal person in order to establish shops scattered throughout Paris, which were subject to highly variable royal privileges that were constantly contested and challenges. Thank you. So, all of you who wish to participate in the debate, please do it. Fill the forms you can find here. We will see each other here again in 20 minutes after the break. Thank you.
Passiamo dunque alla fase del dibattito.
We open the debate. We're going to follow the order of the presentations that have been delivered so far. I would like to invite the first round of questions by Anna Belavitis. Thank you. Thank you for these wonderful papers, communication. Just a small question for you. The relationship with countrysides, cocoons, worms. So I would like to know something on the countryside, which is a milestone for our meetings.
Grazie. Segue sempre per lo stesso relatore.
For the same speaker, Renzo Sabatini. So congratulations to all the speakers this morning. This has been an incredible morning session. I really appreciated it indeed. I've got just a remark, so deriving from the fact that shown bibliography is quite limited, but I was very much struck by the absence of the works by Carlo Poni. Why? How come? Because are less older than the longer period. So for him. So now two curiosities indeed. So marginal ones, I guess. So Saint Jerome as a patron. I would like to understand why the choice of this Saint Jerome. So the choice of Saint patrons is also key in arts, and also the issue of the black color. Why this color come in black now? So I've some remembrances about this, but Venice, the Sea Republic of Venice, just releases some patents on the use of the black color. Is there any kind of a connection? We know also relationship to Genoa, but this black of Venice, there was a sort of patent issued for the use of it. Thank you. Carlos. Good morning, all of you. For these communications, incredibly good. Well, for my colleague, Germán Navarro, I want to know something more about apprentices statutes, the statutes for apprenticeship, for the town of Zaragoza. Do you have any sources, any news about that? And the second question, there is any sort of connection links between these regulations and the several cities? Are they copies or just freestand statutes, or just copies of previously issued statutes in other towns? You got me right, don't you? Good. What che ho fatto? No, so for this influence, also of Italy, for some silk fabrics or cloths, so we have some problems as to silk. So also we have one problem of fashion, of customs, technological transfer also is an issue. And also we have some problems about the organization of the silk trade. You agree with me, don't you? So you agree, it seems like this is a sort of different world. So Venice looking at the East and Spain, which is most affected by the Islamic culture. Do you agree with me? If you agree on this separation, so are there anything intermingle? And if yes, to which extent? And also the problem of Lucca, the city of Lucca, the town of Lucca in Tuscany. And this very much affected silk making in Venice, in Venice, which is just off the road. So I believe the Islamic influence has been very important, as much important as the Chinese one to Venice, to the Venetian Republic. Luca Marat's book confirmed this, the problem of silk in Venice and the Chinese world.
Mario Grassi.
Mario Grassi. I want to congratulate you for the organization of this session, and I've got this question to Professor Navarro Espinach. So first and foremost, I want to stress the importance of having this approach focusing on the statutes and the lexicon used by primary sources. But it was asking me if you have some witnesses, secondary witnesses, or evidence as to the examination to pass. Because according to the regulations, the examination seems to be very, 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 very hard. I think just the purchase of wood for the management of the spinning loom. Looms needed wood, and the spinners didn't get the money to buy such expensive, costly wood. And the second thing is linked with the changes in the re-editing of statutes in the same city, like Venice. Thank you. Shall I answer now? Yes, please. You can go ahead. Thank you for questions raised to me. Thank you. I appreciate. Before the question of Professor Bellavitis. Professor Bellavitis at Genoa University. You teach in Genoa, don't you? Sorry. It's so interesting, the relationship to the countryside, because the ambition of these guilds is controlling also the arrival of raw materials. And we have cities like Granada or Murcia having a wide territory, huge peasant community working silk. So the regulation of the city tries also to take control of this process, silk making. But for other countries or small areas of the Valencia kingdom, not only we have statutes or regulations on these primary phases by some brotherhoods or local population, but it's up to the communes. So the municipal deeds being a testimony of how this activity was organized in the countryside. Sometimes the hypothetical crisis of an urban industry certainly is a scattering or dispersion of the rural industry. This comes straight to the city, but that's an expansion of its own artisans for the country. That's a bit curious. Always we say urban industry and rural industry is not a separate world, but they are strongly connected. And in case of Granada, Murcia, and Valencia, these are manufacturing, producing regions, so producing raw materials. That's key. And here we can see this much better. Well, for Professor Sabatini's question, we refer to one of the most important historians for silk industry, like Carlo Poni, professor at the Bologna University. I said Bologna. I said the right name of the university this time. I was clever enough. He carried out a wonderful study on Bologna, differentiating from Spain. Two sectors, the white work of veils and the dyed work of drapes. Francesco Battistini also is important for mulberry cultivation and the production of silk. All this bibliography is important. Let's switch to the topic of the patron. Jerome, he is a patron of notaries, of booksellers, librarians also. There is a book, I don't remember the name of its author, saying Saint Jerome as the patron of an impressive amount of guilds in Italy. Saint Jerome, what I thought before. Okay, in Genoa, they have some Jeromes. And technological transfer is also an act of devotion in between. Saint Jerome is famous for the art of velveters, but I do not exactly know the origin. The origin can be, I don't know, a nunnery, friaries, brothers or friars of Saint Jerome. So this can be the main source of this. I carried out a study of medieval confraternities in Spain, or worships, or devotions. So I studied many cases like this one. But the case of Saint Jerome, that's a sort of promotion by the order of Saint Jerome. The topic of the black color, so Brodel, a singer, started this story, the fashion. So black is very hip, fashionable, trendy at the end of the Middle Ages. We speak of black silk, but in case of Genoa, it's very important, the black color. Paolo Massa, Chiara Chiara, they have been referring to this important presence of the color black. Also in the tax sources, fiscal sources, in the Genoese tax archives, we can see this mention of the black color. 60% of the drapes were dyed in black at the end of the 15th century. But the case of Venice is different. We speak of a huge variety of situations, because Venice since 1347, we have the art of velveters. The first time ever we have such a guild of velveters, velvet makers. This is not mentioned in. So the color is not mentioned in the statutes, which is really an obsessive theme at the early 16th century in Spain. And also in Genoa, I've seen no specific reference to the color in Genoa. Records of 1432, and also in Luca Molla's books on the Lucchese's community in Venice. No reference I've seen so far to the black, like black velvet at the end of the 15th century in Genoa.
Professore L'Aliena, collega e amico.
So, professor, colleague by Zaragoza. So, the topic of apprenticeship. Well, this is also interesting because in the case of Zaragoza, also thanks to the support of the researchers from the department, I found some notary deeds showing that Genoese people in Zaragoza around 1496 were there, but there was no corporation. So there are notary deeds with no statutes of the corporations, but these deeds show that there is a tradition of 5 years of presence of these people, of these workers. And we also have references of further notary deeds for other trades with no statutes, but with an oral habit, with an oral tradition. And this is also showed in the case of Valencia, which is the topic of my PhD back in '85. And we do have an archive about the trade of silk from 1679 until today. We do have a register, which is part of the statutes. We have the books, administrative books with the contracts of apprenticeship. We have the names of the notary publics. We have the names of the workers, of the apprentices. First of all, these are contracts dating 3 years before, which have been signed by 3 years before. And then, so they started 3 years before, and then they were completed in Valencia. So 3 years of apprenticeship, for example, are documented in the registers in the trades of the velvet makers. And then these apprentices then finished the apprenticeship in Valencia. It's very curious. There are very curious, weird cases. So there are different cases documented in different places. This is also for workers in Genoa. There we do not have a notary register, a notary deed. That's also so. There was the need, of course, of writing down the names, writing down the contracts. So in some cases, as I said, we have documents, we have notary deeds. We have sources from notary deeds, in some cases not. And it also depends on the different trades. So the labor market was documented, but again, not evenly and not comprehensively for all trades. Now, the second question for Professor della. Well, that is not the only one case, because there are state statutes which are the exact copy of what has been done before. So they are, for example, the case of Malaga is very clear. We have an exact copy of the statutes of Granada and Sevilla. There where we had trades which had been settled previously. So this is what happens in some cases. Also in some for hospitals, for contracts of workers in hospitals. That is the case of Zaragoza, for example. There's a study showing this and demonstrating this. So we have an exact copy in Valencia of a case in Castilla, which is a nearby region. Professor Cidiacono, yes. So, well, it is really very interesting because the topic of Venice, because the trade of silk as raw material in Venice, it was the silk of Katai. It was Chinese silk, whereas in Genoa, it was a Spanish silk from Granada, from the Muslim reign of Granada. So this is a first very important and crucial differentiation. But for sure, in Venice has for sure a very direct relationship with Lucca. So, and there, the silk workers promote in Venice their work. But in the case of Spain, well, here it is different on the other side, because this is a process which is bound to the Islamic, manufacturing. It's a different production, a different manufacturing. We are in southern Italy, we are in Calabria, and here you have the work of Sara Procopio on the topic, on the theme of silk in the south. And here we have a more direct relationship. The Muslim Sicily also has a very interesting tradition, the presence of artisans, Byzantine but also Muslim artisans. So Byzantine again and Muslim artisans are there. So you have kind of a mix up. You have Carmelo Traseria, Professor Carmelo Traseria, also discussed on this a few years ago. So the topic of Professor Grassi on the management of corpses, also linked to the statutes. Well, the management of corpses is also interesting when we do have books of the trades. These are also kind of registers, like the registers of apprenticeship contracts. So there you have similar registers detailing all the single kinds of textiles and the relative master of trade. These registers are not official ones, but we can find in the deeds of the municipalities, we have claims against the examiners for familiar endogamy, and also the title of velvet maker master. There's the passing of this title to a relative. Without having passed the examination. But the city, so the local government, well, they have their courts, the local courts, managing this kind of claims. And what does the city, in this case, the city donates, gives out the title beyond this claim. So it has been demonstrated that it was actually a familiar endogamy case. So there was a corruption. It was a corruption case, actually. But we do have, again, notarial deeds. We have it all demonstrated. So this is an example case, a practical case. So this is what happened. Because on the one side, you have the theory of the statutes, and then you have the practice, and you know that there arise problem and issues. Then, again, the statutes, the topic of the statutes, there we have a tradition of publishing in the 16th century, and then afterwards, there have been also transcriptions. We have then the epoch of the Catholic kings. We have the epoch of Philip II, and we have been then many statutes because they are then they have been confirmed for further 150 years. So we have a long tradition of statutes starting from a certain period. So, and it has also been confirmed from Charles II that after the end of the dynasty of the Austrian kings, well, there we had the same privileges given and also documented. So you have the confirmation of the use of certain documents. And I would like to maybe I'm out of time, so I'm finished. Well, using my role as session president, I would like to add a couple of words on this because we have done a lot with Los Jerónimos. Well, I'm wondering whether the settlement of textiles activities and trades close to rivers, if it has something to do with this or not. Because in the context of Jerónimo de Spagna, we have the monastery of Santa Paula in Sevilla. There we have a river close by. So, and there was channels there in Barrel San Luis. So these two cases, I know them quite well, and I'm wondering, again, if the coexistence in the same area, in the same territory of the monasteries of Jerónimos and these kind of activity is, if the two are linked or not. Well, in the case of Valencia, the monastery of San Jerome is in Candia. So, well, it starts there, the organization in the monastery itself, the monastery, the organization of the corporation. So, yes, of course, the presence of this kind of the river, and so we have documents about hydraulic plants. So there we have also the celebration of the feast, and we still have the seat of the silk trade dating back to 1400. And I also reflected on the iconography on this, because in the trade of silk makers in Valencia, Saint Jerome is cardinal, and this is, well, he was a hermit actually. So this is quite weird, but he is a cardinal with his red robe, with the typical purple red robe, and we could see a reference there to the liturgy, to the power of church. Saint Jerome himself could be a notary public as iconographic element. So let's think about iconography in these terms. In my speech, I talked about the book of tanners in Valencia, where in the statutes it is stated that the flag should be so and so, and there you have the representation in the book of statutes. It is represented. So, and it's weird also the representation of St. Michael's. There you have the same in the books of statutes, which now are in the Hispanic Society in New York of the velvet makers. There you have the same representation as a cardinal, not as a hermit. Also representation dating back to the 1400. So then you have also other different representations, but this is a kind of anachronism. This is a reference. These are references we found, but I do not see a link with the other aspect you mentioned. Now let's go on with the questions on the second speech by Valeria Chilese. Maria, please.
Tutta quanto il panel questa mattina.
I would like to thank all the panel this morning. Everything has been very interesting. Beautiful ideas, Valeria. What was questioning me is the following. So that's a sort of an idea of widening the concept. You said something about the craft guilds, the relationship between the town and the countryside. But we have three levels. The dominant one, with one pole, which is the attraction city in Verona. We have the mountain community, three levels, and also one level, which is missing in the Venetian historiography, which can be welcomed now. We have the Council of the Ten Wise Men, which is strategic, controlling quarries and mines. At the second half of the 16th century, we have the establishment of a specific magistracy for the registration of those mines and quarries. And also we have the crossing of eminent strategic questions. So the state is also involved with a very interesting interaction with the Adige River movements and the tithe policy, which is very strategic for the tithe. So can you elaborate on this? Can you consider these in terms of strategic materials? All these sounds strategic. In the latest years, we've been carrying out far-reaching research, and your stone cutters really fit the issue. Thank you. Mattia Fochesato.
Sì, grazie anche da parte mia a tutti.
Thank you, all the speakers. So I'm a bit ignorant. I don't know. I was also busy with some little divergences in Europe. My own is more a curiosity in the narration and in the literature on DST, the comparison between North and South of Europe. Usually we speak of the rural area narration. The rural areas are not very well developed. That's a rough understanding, but still we have this approach. Instead, out of your communication, we have a rural area very well developed with professional activities, not just farming, and also very, very powerful from the economic viewpoint. I want to ask you, can you elaborate more on this point? Is it an isolated case, or can this be real also in other backgrounds to rewrite the narration for the Italian southern rural areas? Thank you. Jaco?
A short question. People working in these quarries were exposed to considerable risk. I mean, we know this from mining and similar activities in pre-modern Europe. And I was just wondering, if we think about the organization of laborers, is there anything you could tell us about whether they try to pool risks and create some sort of arrangements for people who suffered injuries or perhaps even died while working in these quarries and were exposed to this risk in a pretty dangerous business, I would say? Thank you.
Grazie. Prego, questi sono le domande.
Presidente, avevo chiesto anch'io di dire qualcosa insieme.
Prego.
Con la stessa scheda.
Ah, non l'avevo.
Out of mic, no translation. We make an apology for that. Well, this problem is a problem I just wanted to raise. So, occupational diseases, professional diseases, occupational disease, this very modern point. We speak of the powder, marble powder, so glass powder. People can inhale and get sick. That's my disclosures. So for the rice piles, we have also some evidence for paper piles. So the Venetians are very present in this region. In marble, we have piles being the key tools. Do you have any news about the use of piles?
Grazie intanto. Per quanto riguarda...
First and foremost, the remark by Maria, yes, of course. How to say, the elements are three elements, and the role of Venice is a crucial role. For Valpolicella history, where one vicissitude, starting from the 15th century, with a full set of privileges being bestowed by the Serenissima Council to Valpolicella, just to go against the will of Verona. I mean wine, but also marble, so stones. This can be explained this very way. That's obvious, certain. Also because marble from Verona is bought also by the nobility, the aristocrats of Venice. Yes, so my answer is definitely yes. Well, for the other point, relevant to the narration of the less or more developed areas, well, to speak plain, the Ambrosian situation is a special one, a study made by Varanini on the Valpolicella, so with some peculiarities. So this quarrying activity is constant from the Middle Ages up to now. Now, quarries are almost, that's over, but we still keep on excavating stones, also in open pit quarries, not just mines. And this is also seen in the registrations. So, I mean, that's a special element within an area having some difficulties of management. So we have a constant flow in activity, some common trips from the trip to the townscape, to the town. Well, the other point relevant to the risk and occupational diseases are not very well prepared. And I make an apology for the 16th, 17th century. I didn't find anything for this. And as a documentation center for Valpolicella, we've been working for the 18th century. Yes, we have the problem of powders, processes being harmful, very, very, very dangerous sometimes, harmful. But in the 16th, 17th century documents, I didn't find any source, any material to back all this. For the type of the production, I made reference to these small stones for rice working. I didn't find any document. But after the Middle Ages, we have this new specialty of these machines, and then we have some specialty for the altars. These altar makers just moving all around, and during the large period of migration, they will move also, they will go to the Americas for making altars, being skilled altar makers, but I didn't find any source in paper. Sorry. Let's switch now to questions for Patrick Wallis.
Allora, il relatore chiede, come avete sentito, di rispondere domande, che è anche giustificato dalla mole di domande che riceve. Andrea, prego.
Grazie anche da parte mia a tutti.
Thank you all.
Presentation. I have a question on the this multiple membership in more than one guilds. If you can say something about the adjacent or related sectors. So if they were in guilds, for instance, you have shown drapers and merchants or in the same textile, or if they are in the same chain of production, or if they use the same raw material. Because you have done a very nice also introduction about very different sector, the barber and the shoemaker, I don't remember well, or the baker and the shoemaker. And I agree with you that we have some types of pluriactivity that is very important to consider also in the case of ownership of different industries, but they are not practitioner of the trade. So this is the first. And the second, this is depends on my ignorance about the London case. Were the barrier to entering the guilds the same for all the guilds, or were there some guilds more open than other in terms of the entrance of the guilds? This is my ignorance. Okay? But thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. Two great questions, and thank you for allowing me to answer them afterwards. I forget things too quickly nowadays. We looked at related sectors. I think it was a really natural thing to ask whether shoemakers are with leather producers, that type of thing. I should have included it. We didn't find a clear pattern. I thought we might, but actually it's much more diverse than that. So that doesn't actually help explain, but maybe I will put that in the final paper. And the second question about barriers to entry in London guilds, there are some differences, but they are quite small. The fees are a little bit different, but not very different. And the amount of time it takes to qualify as an apprentice is similar across almost all the guilds, very, very little variation. So that doesn't seem to help explain it, although you're right to raise this as a very good hypothesis. Thank you.
Arnaldo Melo, por favor.
Thank you very much. My questions are a little bit similar to the Andrea's one. So my main question is, of course, we know, for instance, in Portugal, which I know better, in the 16th century, it's quite usual that different crafts can be together in the same guild. Usually, somehow connected crafts, but not always connected, or at least for us, sometimes it's not obvious why they are put together in the same guild. But that brings me to a second level of question, which is we know that if we look at this medieval, or in this case modern society, through the lens of the crafts and guilds organization, we can suppose to be seeing a society very well organized. And we know that is not the case. So that polyactivity is a reality. We know that a person can be a shoemaker and be part of a shoemaker's guild, but he can at the same time do completely different things. So my question is, it's a question, but it is also a comment from you. Is this types of situations also happen in London? At the same time, in London, there was that exclusivity. Only people that were part of those guilds could do that work, or saying in other words, was there this kind of craft work outside at the guilds, or at London that was not possible? And of course that goes also to another question put by Andrea, which is, of course, one thing is the master crafts, the techniques. The other thing is entrepreneurs, the merchants, or other types of people that are the investors. And of course the investors, they could and they did invest in very different activities. My question is, if I have well understood, the people that are members of those London crafts are mainly craftsmen, or they can be also merchants? Or for the London society that doesn't make sense at all? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Really, really interesting questions. Thank you very much. This question of umbrella guilds, I think, is what Andrea talked about yesterday. I think is a really important question, but I think it's a different phenomenon to what I'm talking about. We do have some, well, all guilds are umbrellas by some definition, and Matthew behind you works on the London Merchant Tailors. In their name, they have this combination of two occupations. Other guilds in London do have multiple occupations, and they split sometimes. So there are umbrellas here. But I think that the umbrellas don't explain how this umbrella has members from this umbrella. And that is the phenomenon that I think is really surprising, which is what we're really thinking about here. Is this about polyactivity? I am sure that these people do not do one thing. But this is the identity that they report. So I think you're right to raise this as a factor, and I think it may explain some of the ways in which people move from one occupation to another. I think marriage is another factor. I think there's lots of other things that might drive this. But I think that the mental model that they are working with is of monoactivity. And so this in some senses is about how their dominant occupational identity is being presented to the world and yet is still different to their craft and their guild. So I'm sure I would agree with you, polyactivity, very important in early modern cities, but I think maybe it helps explain some of the sources of this, but I don't think it explains quite what we see. In terms of the mix of entrepreneurs and artisans, these guilds include merchants, investors, and craftsmen of all kinds, and there's no clear separation between a merchant guild and other guilds, which is one of the sources of this as well in London, that London never achieves a strong independent merchant guild. Despite a few guilds really trying, they fail. And I think that my story is partly a story of legal failures, right? Even in a city of powerful institutions, they fail to control the situation fully, and that explains why you end up with this situation. So I think those are really good points. Thank you.
Grazie. Eric Wilhelm.
Yes, so I too have a special fondness for quantitative descriptive statistics and clever graphs, that sort of thing. So my questions is related to kind of the final claim that you made about the relationship between the weakness of guilds and their dynamism. At the end, you demonstrate that they become kind of more coherent over time. How does that relate to dynamism, and what's kind of the variable that you're using to measure dynamism, right? And with respect to the 12 great guild houses, also kind of building off of Andrea's question about those particular guilds, those were the top of the top, where they kind of had the broadest umbrella, the widest umbrella of the guilds. Were they more kind of vertically integrated, kind of compared to the rest of the guilds? So thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Someone else who likes numbers, brilliant.
Quindi ti piacciono i numeri, benissimo. Quindi
the economic dynamism is that of London and really the English economy. One of the many early graphs I showed was a graph trying to measure Smithian growth. And we have a paper that we produced a working paper last year. What that shows is that Smithian growth really concentrates in London. So London is the driver of specialization in the English economy in the 17th century. The greater London, not just the city, but the Middlesex, the entire area, is really seeing much greater division of labour than anywhere else. And we see that happening in the 17th century. So this growing corporate coherence coincides with really rapid specialization. And so that dynamism, aligned with everything else we see in the national economy, seems to be the surprising bit of the finding. Obviously, we don't know whether other people will accept those measurements yet. They aren't published. The Great 12, I think, are an important part of why we get this weird situation in London. And one of the reasons is that they absorb very successful people from other guilds. So, if Germán becomes really, really successful, he will be translated into one of the Great 12 guilds because he's going to be one of the people who run the City of London. And that translation means that whatever he does, his occupation then ends up as one of the occupations in that Great 12. So there's a trade-off, coherence against power, and they choose power, I think, over coherence. So I think that's one of the things that matters here. Thank you. Good questions.
Anna Belavitis.
Thank you very much. So, Patrick, about the London customs, I had in mind the case studied by Amy Erickson of the milliners who were members of the Clockmakers Guild because a milliners guild did not exist. But your story is different. In the case of Venice, what happens in the 18th century, yes, in the 18th century, is that you find masters, or any masters, I don't know, but people, doing many different things, like cotton weaving, pants or pot selling, and making apprenticeship contracts. So it's impossible to know in what guild they were, if they were in a guild, because we don't know. So sorry to bring you back to apprenticeship, but how did it work with those masters who were not members of the right guild? Also because we mentioned the problem of the control of quality. So who controlled what and whom? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. Anna and I, we both love apprenticeship, right? We have both spent too long counting apprentices. Yeah, of course. So one of the reasons that these are new measures is that until we found this source, we didn't have any sources where you had guild and occupation written down. And these sources write them down because they're complaints about training. So there are many reasons in London you can complain about training, you know, maybe your master's like not treating you well, maybe, you know, they're not feeding you properly, maybe they're beating you. Sorry, I don't mean to assign any motivations. But one of the causes is poor quality training. So the occupation matters, and that's why we get this together just in this source and only a handful of others. There's some others. So we do know here what the training is meant to be in, and when we look at the narrative records around this court, it's very clear that they really are concerned with the occupation. The kind of quality control really does remain within the main guild. That is one of the things that's really striking. So some guilds in London actually try and work out systems that mean that if you're a member of another guild, you can still get the mark to stamp your product. It doesn't work very well, but they try. And I think this is one of the tensions that runs through the system. So quality is still tied to the guild, but it exists in a tension with this system that always pulls against it. So I'm not sure if that kind of fully answers your question, but it's, yeah.
Jakob?
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Really shaking things up. But I really think this is very intriguing. I have two questions. The first is, can you exclude multiple guild membership based on your sources? I admire what you are doing, but I can also imagine that individuals are member of their proper guilds and then also of another guild. Which brings me to my second question, because I've seen this sort of multiple guild membership in late medieval sources. In the southern Low Countries, I know that larger guilds with their own hospitals, for instance, providing insurance for old age and for disability, were very attractive. So what you see there is that shoemakers would also try to become and became member of the Weavers Guild, because the weavers had their own hospital. So what I'm trying to do here is to sell you insurance. Is it possible that part of what you are seeing here is simply people saying, well, if I try to become a member of this particular guild, there are some benefits that my correct guild does not provide. If you think about this in the long run, and if you try to remember the graphs you showed and everything that's happening in London between 1500 and, say, 17th, 18th century, I can imagine that in the later Middle Ages, many of these guilds were too small to offer any meaningful type of insurance. But with growth and with scale enlargement, I can imagine that many of these guilds eventually became capable of taking care of their own members, offering them sickness benefits, perhaps a little bit of old age benefits. As always, this is just someone who knows nothing about London, yada, 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 talking, but I mean, I've seen this. It exists in the late medieval Low Countries, and I mean, they seek an additional crafts guild membership for the sake of insurance. And I was just wondering whether you could imagine that this could be a factor at play.
Thank you very much. You never yada, yada, yada. Come on. I don't think that I can't think of any multiple guild membership in London in this period. It seems that they're exclusive. There's a system to move, but not to double enter. I may be missing something, but I can't remember anything.
But Patrick, would there be any way to be sure about this?
Well, I'm trying to think if there is. I mean, it would be, I haven't seen it, let me put it like that, and I think it would be novel. I think we do see this for fraternities, confraternities in the 15th century. There, we definitely know there's multiple membership. But I think one of the interesting things about your comparison is that your base case is a kind of welfare guild provider. And one of the effects of the Reformation on English guilds is that their role in relief and welfare becomes much smaller. And a lot of that role is taken up after 1600 by the parish, in the parish poor law. So when you look at what guilds are doing, it's really very little. There's some old age pensions, maybe a few almshouses, but there's no, no sickness benefits, none of the things that you've traced in the Netherlands, which is really surprising. But they lose that role. That role goes to the parish under the poor law. So the motivation for this multiple insurance also goes away. So I think that might be why we don't see it, or I'm not aware of it. I can connect, I have a lot of names. I can look at whether these double up, but I think we would know about it. So it's a really interesting hypothesis. It's one of the big differences across, if we think about functionality of guilds, the welfare role of guilds is really diverse. And I mean, it's interesting we haven't talked about it very much in the last day and a half. So I think there would be space for that. Thank you.
Grazie. Mattia Forzato.
Thank you, Patrick. So my question is about the distinction between homogeneity and closure and the different implications they might have. So if I understand correctly, if you're not close, you have a less number of shoemakers, say your example, but you're still having mostly shoemakers, right? So, and that means that you might remain quite orthodox in your internal regulation. So if you're not homogeneous instead, my sensation is that you're watering a little bit your internal regulation. So, and given the fact that, if I remember correctly, you find that guilds are more close than homogeneous, isn't that, so here I'm playing the devil's advocate, isn't that playing still in favor of the weakening of guilds argument? Because you find they're very close, but not so homogeneous. They're below the 45-degree line. I also like measurement.
Yeah. No, I know. We share this.
So I don't know.
I think does it play in support of the weakening? Well, explain. Sorry, I'm not.
Yeah, because you find that guilds are not as homogeneous as you would expect, given their closeness. So if they're not homogeneous, they have to accept much wider heterogeneity. And so they have to order a little bit, to relax a little bit their strict regulations. So they also incentivize competitive behavior across guilds that in a certain way might reduce their power. And, well, it's just a suggestion.
It's a really interesting hypothesis. I will have to think about this, because I mean, the fact that they end up with different scores is one of the things that was interesting, and we checked it was true, and it's a function of the distribution of occupations between small and large guilds, actually. But yeah, I will have to think about whether that creates some kind of incentive in the way that you're thinking about it. I'm not sure I've got enough brain power to give you a forceful answer right now, but I will take that away and think about it, so thank you.
Maria?
And now for something completely different. So, thank you very much, Patrick. I really like your iconoclasm. My observation comes from a position of ignorance, because I've never worked on guilds, and most of what I know I've learned over the last 2 days. You mentioned, I like your iconoclasm because it's going towards one of the big shibboleth, the customs of London. Such a mythological creature. William the Conqueror, a bit, Henry I. London in the 12th century is a rather different beast from London in the 17th century. What strikes me is that the London guild structure is a political structure. And paradoxically, the way I see things from the outside, it slowly becomes an economic thing by the time in which you start to deal with your quantitative analysis. So I am not surprised that they get more specialized, particularly given your consideration about the Smithian growth element that corresponds, in a sense, with this. So what strikes me is, this is a legal, political issue. And the problem that happens exactly when you were mentioning the Glorious Revolution, which for some of us is kind of a daily foil, is that it's the moment in which London gets punished, and so much of what were the legal prerogatives of the city get hammered down, both at the beginning, in the 60s with the Restoration, and then in the later stage. So I would like to be tempted to do that wonderful Einstein misquote, which of course is not Einstein but Cameron, that not everything that is countable counts, and you might find the answer in which precise element of the London customs, plural, originates this type of legislation, which originally was designed to increase the demography of the city of London and the political solidity more than the economic productivity of what by the 17th century had become the monster metropolis that didn't need guilds anymore.
Thank you. I think that's an interesting point. I absolutely agree that not everything that is countable counts. I hope that in this case, what is countable does count, because it gets to the constitution of what these guilds are. I think you're right to highlight the changing political and economic significance of guilds, which I think is certainly the case in London, and I think is certainly the case across other European cities as well. To me, that's a directive to think carefully about the varying roles that guilds can play within political ecosystems, rather than assuming that they have a single function or single essential nature that defines guild versus other form of corporatism. Whether they are becoming more economically significant over the 17th century, I'm not so sure. I think I would actually move that back. I think the 15th to the 16th century is when that really happens in terms of London, when it goes from being a small elite corporate system to being a mass corporate system, where really almost everyone economically active at a kind of substantive level is in one of these guilds. That's by around 1550, 1530. So I would endorse your broad point, absolutely. I think the reason that I find this question fascinating is that for a very long time, people have speculated about what it is that the internal coherence of the guild might do to their survival, their persistence, their impact. And I think it's nice to answer those speculations with some numbers. Yeah, so when people ask questions that are, let me respond. When people ask questions that are quantifiable, we should quantify. That would be my response to that as well. Thank you.
Mario Grassi, prego.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for your fascinating presentation and your research of perspective. I find really interesting on many levels, from the role of heterogeneity and coherence to the dialogue between micro and macro. Yes. I was wondering if you know something from your sources about places and where those people live or, were born, etc., and how this aspect, if it's actually present, can affect the participation in one of the guilds, both doing another job. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mario. We know a lot about where these people come from, and in the book that you should all buy, really, it's excellent for Christmas presents. There's a long discussion about the geographical origins of apprentices, who are by far the main source. And one of the things that's striking is that there's no strong regional patterning of entry to these organizations. So there's no place connection, or there's a very weak place connection which helps shape entry to guilds. So they're not, one guild is not drawing from one county or one town or one particular set of these. Instead, they are very open, which touches on this openness question. The first bit of this was published in the Journal of Economic History in 2011, so it's old stuff. But it raises a really fundamental question about what might hold these guilds together. And if we think about the connections between people within guilds, we see where you live in London, so your local neighborhood, becomes more important in shaping who you trust over the 17th century than it had. So that grows in importance over the 17th century. So we see actually a localization, an increasing importance of neighborhood for economic activity in London over the same period. If you want to see, that's the English Historical Review a couple of years ago on trust in guilds. Again, highly citable, but not commercially available. Thank you.
Grazie. Passiamo ora all'ultima relazione.
Thank you. Now we have the last presentation, Julie Claustre.
Alors, on passe à une communication très différente, comme Mathieu l'avait dit lui.
Well, this is a very different communication, as Mathieu was saying, with it's a different approach. This is a historical review of the corporations. I have some observations to do, which you can react on. Mathieu, we can open a discussion between experts of Middle Ages about Paris and other countries, but I would like to focus on how the professional space is managed within the guilds. So what is corporative and what is not corporative in all the urban activities which are handled within the guilds? We have talked a lot about it today, but we have to bear in mind that the activities which remain within the guilds well, many activities remains within the guilds. So in the cities, there are some activities, some business sectors, and sometimes some kinds of activities which remain in the guilds. But let's consider that with the big success of corporations and of corporative organizations, well, there's a wider world which is outside the corporations, and this we cannot lose sight on it, because we are now focusing on the guilds and corporations, but we are maybe losing a bit the overview on the rest of the work job market. So I'm focusing on the interregionality and local aspect of the guilds, but also of different kind of corporations and corporative organizations. So this is really strong in Paris from an economical point of view, from a legal point of view, from a juridical point of view. So this has a strong influence on the workers' life. And this is important in assessing the economic life of the cities. This is a deep aspect of the job market and work market. I also have a question. Well, why in the 60s of 18th century the apothecaries wanting to enter the corporation, I'm underlining in the 60s of 17th century, because if I think about the Italian cases I know, well, that's exactly the moment from which the power of guilds and corporations starts to weaken. So also the control on the trade, on the crafts, is not so much important, and there's a kind of anarchy. So why the privileged apothecaries wanted to enter the corporation, the guilds? Well, thank you for your questions and for your observations, also to Julie. Well, concerning the space of corporative organizations, well, Paris, 500,000 inhabitants at those times, probably like 20,000 masters in there. So just to give you an idea, a rough idea. But there was the capacity for some trades to make workers work in a kind of fluid way. We talked about it yesterday. So we talked about the bonnets makers in Paris, right? So that case in particular, that was maybe mid-18th century, so 4,000 workers. So there you had a series of workers, of specialized workers to take care of this kind of profession. So that was the point of the iceberg. So we have said, I told you there were like 60 masters and 60 workshops. So 600,000 inhabitants in 18th century. So one each 8,000 inhabitants. So in sectors of remedies and medicines, these apothecaries, well, which is their clientele? These are people, the great noble houses, the great monasteries. These were their customs, the clients, and of course the hospitals. So what attracts the apothecaries is, collective work and also the trade. So to be part of the trade. So there was kind of organization. There was also kind of lack of interest from the policy concerning the way these products were sold on the streets, for example, by apothecaries who were not part of the guilds. So these are also strong economic challenges concerning huge sum of money, huge amounts of money. So in Paris, you had 10,000, 20,000, 30,000
Pourtant, dans l'espace parisien,
livres. So again, we have this relationship between incorporation of products and incorporation of people. What is incorporated? Well, of course, the corporation included both groups. We have the corporation starting from the beginning of the 17th century. We have the so-called royal right over goods, where you have goods managed by a craft, a guild. Well, they have, control power, police power on those goods. So where you have this kind of goods, the police can come and seize these goods. So every private individual having this kind of goods can be inspected by the corporation, by the guild. They can be visited by overseers. And this is normal, that belonged to the organization of corporations in Paris at those times. So this is a way to trace, the goods in the city. I also worked on a process of a duke who was accused to own some goods, and he is attacked in court by the corporation. So just imagine the power these corporations had, also with respect to royal rights. So if you have goods, you are a merchant, and you can be judged by the corporation since you are a merchant. So we have studied the statutes of these corporations, and it is evident that within the corporations you had the control of education, of training. You have the surveillance of the corporations. We focused a lot on this, so you were right in your observation on Paris. Now I'm focusing on goods and on the places where goods are stored. But yes, you're right. It's about the incorporation of the privileged apothecaries, the membership of these apothecaries. Well, these individuals were threatened, and they were subject to very expensive procedures. So corporations, well, you had 24 trades, and they shared expenses. So if one individual was attacked, so the expenses were shared. So the corporation allowed the privileged apothecaries to share the expenses, those expenses, those costs. So of course that was also a reason why to become member of the guilds which allowed this. So apothecaries, for example, they they were twinned with the grocers guild, so they are often like linked and together. They are 160. Just imagine their power, their financial power of such a huge group. So this capacity of the corporation to attract people, young people, and of legalizing, trade. This is really crucial. So the privileged apothecaries, we can see that they remained privileged. Not all of them entered the guilds or the corporations. The second generation, so maybe their son did it, but of course, the first privileged apothecaries were attracted by this. I hope I have answered your question. So let's conclude the session, thanking the speakers. We will continue here at 3 p.m. See you later. Thank you.